I'm going to invite Janice Marie Johnson to offer us a centering. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you, Elizabeth. These are words from the Reverend Alicia Ford. When we pause to remember who we are, companions on this great experiment called life, when we take a moment to shed the ways we have been carefully taught, to lead from fear, to punish the poor, to persecute those who don't look like we do, to deny rights to those who love, to believe that we are separate, that some people are superior to others. When we take a moment to shed all of that and hear our stories, hear and see each other into existence, into community, when we take a moment to embrace, to practice a different way of being, when we answer the call of love, then we are living into the promise of building the world we dream about. It is beautiful to dream, to cast a vision, to stretch our minds into the future and imagine what may be if we were to build a new way of being, not someday, but beginning again today, beginning again every day that we have breath, taking courage with these hands and hearts to make real the dream of a more equitable world, to journey together, to seek being transformed even as we transform, becoming explorers and learners in this world around us, humbled by what we do not yet know, fulfilling the promise of healing a fragmented world, laboring not just in hope, but also in love. In this spirit we commit. In this spirit we gather. In this spirit we pray. Blessings for the journey.
Thank you so much, Janice. So welcome again to everyone. I'm Reverend Elizabeth Nguyen, and I'm really grateful to be here with so many colleagues and fellow learners on the journey. This is a webinar that I think maybe we somewhat ambitiously titled Love Resists Through Radical Presence, ICE and Court Accompaniment Programs. And I'll sort of be your facilitator and host, and then over the course of our time together, which will last till about 8:15 Eastern, we'll hear from many other folks and also have time for folks to share questions in the chat and reflect on where we go from here, whether we're someone who is just beginning to think about what it might be like to journey alongside folks who are being targeted by ICE and deportation, or whether we ourselves are experiencing that targeting, or whether we're working with a group of folks who's been doing this work for many, many years or is just beginning. So a few framing things. We often talk about expanded sanctuary or accompaniment as ways that we can support or have the backs of folks who are being targeted by criminalization. In this space, we're primarily talking about folks who are being targeted by immigration and customs enforcement for their status in this country. But court accompaniment programs have happened over many, many decades and have included folks who are targeted by their criminalization and the criminal justice system. It's funny to use this word accompaniment or to talk about accompaniment work because in many ways it's like what we already do for our friends and family. So in a training that we had here in Boston, we started it by asking folks to think of a time that someone accompanied you through something hard. And to think about what was powerful about that, what was challenging about that. we have all at some point in our lives been accompanied and accompanied others. In my family, my father immigrated from Vietnam, and his family was accompanied, though they didn't really call it that. They were sponsored by a Lutheran family and taken in, and they lived with that family for some time and were supported in finding their way in the States by that family. And when I asked those folks, like, why did you do this for my family? Their response was, it was the Christian thing to do. So we call it accompaniment work. Some people call it the Christian thing to do. Others call it like what we would do for our friends or family, or what we would want others to do for us. A few other framing pieces. We are using some of the language of criminalization, which means when being is made illegal by the government. It's not about what people do, it's about who they are. So criminalization are a series of laws and policies that make it against the law to be Muslim or undocumented or Black or trans. And that's just important because sometimes we can get seduced into the idea that people have done something, but it's actually this system of laws that makes it illegal to be. I, at least, am not an expert, and I would maybe say that many of us are learners and not experts. So we're sharing our best wisdom with each other and are learning on the journey, but we're not, at least I am definitely not an immigration attorney, and I am someone who in some ways is very new to this work. So language is a little messy, and we're just gonna flow with it. Sometimes we talk about like the immigrants or like people being targeted by the deportation system, but the language gets slippery because many people who are immigrants themselves accompany other immigrants, and people can be targeted by the deportation system for many reasons. So we just kind of move knowing that. You may be wondering, what are you, like, concretely, what are you talking about? Well, we're going to dive into a few more stories in a moment, but generally speaking, when we talk about accompaniment, we talk about it as part of expanded sanctuary, which is an antidote to this criminalization that so many folks face. And when we say expanded sanctuary, we mean not just sanctuary you may know of where someone is within the four walls of a spiritual community, but where we try to figure out how to take the vision of sanctuary to be free from the violence that criminalizes people, the violence that tears people apart from their loved ones. How do we take that not just in spiritual communities, but out into the world? And so sometimes that looks like going to court with folks. Sometimes that looks like going to ICE check-ins with folks. Sometimes that looks like making phone calls on someone's behalf or writing letters of support or fundraising for legal fees or fundraising for bond money. Basically, it means if you imagine if a dear friend of yours was being targeted by the deportation system, what would you do to fight for them? Accompaniment can fall into any of that. Just a few more things. So often accompaniment is responding to the requests of someone who's being targeted by deportation in the moment and figuring out how we can move forward in this moment. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe that we are interdependent and interconnected. And so part of how we live into that is to have each other's backs. But we also know that systems need to be transformed at the deepest and also the highest levels. And so in accompaniment, our work is always to ask, what would help center someone's dignity in this moment? And also, how can we change this system so that people's dignity is always centered? So it's about responding in the moment and always keeping an eye on how do we change this system so that this work doesn't even need to happen. So it's both of those. So it is all too real for many of us that we can't live in the world and be safe. And we also want to be wise about risk. So for this webinar, I would ask folks to just know that there may be folks listening in who are part of law enforcement. And we ask that folks just hold that anything that we share is stuff that we should be willing to share in court or on our Facebook page or with anyone who would ask. And so just noting that. And we also know that it's hard to assess risk, especially in this political moment. And that sometimes, not always, but sometimes folks with privilege overestimate risk. And so it's a tricky thing to figure out exactly what risks are happening when. And so instead of like running down a long list of do's and don'ts, we'll just all try to bring care and thoughtfulness into this space. I not only work with the Side with Love campaign of our Unitarian Universalist Association, but I've had the honor and privilege to be connected to some emerging accompaniment work here in Boston, where I live. And I want to share 4 of the values that we use in that work, because I think they may be of use in our time together. So we say that we honor people's dignity and choices in a system that denies dignity and choice. We expect messiness, confusion, and discomfort, and we also choose courage and trust. We judge the system, not people, and we fight for one another as family because we are. So enough of me sharing my thoughts. I'm going to invite our amazing panelists who are joining us to share a bit. And I've asked each of them to share a little bit about the accompaniment work that they're doing and how they came into it, to give us an overview. And then to share a story that stands out to them from that work. So I'm going to ask Helen if you would be willing to get us started. I think you can unmute yourself. Perfect. You're good.
I'm good? Okay.
I spoke too soon. You're on it.
All right. We began our accompaniment work through connecting with local immigrant advocacy groups. And we received training through Jobs with Justice. And they had a large training, about 140 Long Islanders came, many people from different faith communities, as well as other organizations. We were trained by immigration lawyers and by Ravi Ragbar from the New Sanctuary Coalition and others. And our training involved understanding what our role is as accompaniers. And the way they looked at it is we were going to go to court with people who had appointments, whether it was traffic court, criminal court, civil court, family court, or immigration court. And any of those places would be places where people might be at risk. Based on what happened there, sometimes there could be decisions made that would lead them into detention and possibly deportation. Sometimes they were just supposed to report, but anytime they were supposed to report is a time of risk. And we found that ICE is now sometimes waiting outside courts or being in the court, and when the person stands up to identify themselves, then they proceed to take them away, and that has happened. So our role as accompaniers in our program is to be witnesses and support. It is not we're not lawyers. We don't really say, get up and speak in front of the judge. We are joining the person who's going to court as a support system, as a community who cares about them. And so it is not meant to be non-confrontational at all, but a support system. And maybe I can give you an example, might be a help. One of the most profound accompaniments that I did was to immigration court with a youth. And the way our procedures work, we work with Jobs with Justice, which has a program where people who want accompaniment tell them, and then they have a list of people trained, and they send out a list through email, such and such a date, such and such a place, here's the person, and time, place, and then you choose which one you can attend based on your schedule. So I went to immigration court with youth, and immigration court is in New York City, and I live about 35 miles from the city, and this young man lived about 50 miles from the city, and it's the only place you can go for court. So we have to catch the train at 6:30 in the morning to be there on time. People came from different corners of Long Island and met at a central place, and then we met someone who was going to direct us and guide us along this process through this organization called Jobs with Justice. And that procedure makes it very simple and easy. And I do recommend you find, if you're interested in doing accompaniment, you find an immigrant advocacy group to work with in your location. So we met Penn Station, and we were guided to immigration court. When we first met this young person, and this is where the humanity and the power of this experience was. Most of us, I think, were surprised because he was such a young person. He was a child. And here is this child who had to come 50 miles by himself. His mother is not documented, so she was not able to accompany him. And he would have had to come by himself, not knowing where to go, not knowing the subway system in New York City, and that alone is traumatic enough. But when we got into the building and we go to room number, whatever room it is, they were all adults. And he's the only child sitting there. And all I could think of is, how could he have managed without this kind of support we were giving him? By himself, dealing with the immigration court, and being such a young person. In the end, we had 12 people, 2 ministers, and it made a big difference to have some people with their collars on. It gives a lot of power to the process. And having community there we're finding that it makes a big difference in the judge's decision, because they see someone who has support, who people are watching, and he has community backing. So in this case, the case was, he was given 6 months to come back again. And that's really much of what we ask for and we hope for. Rather than being taken away, giving them more time. I mean, eventually, hopefully, the cases would be dismissed, but that's not happening very easily. So when we finished in the court, we went outside, and he had been carrying around this big plastic bag. And I know I was wondering, maybe that's lunch, because we were told we'd be there all day, bring your lunch, there's no place to eat. We got outside and we went to a bench, a little street bench, and gathered, and he was saying to each one of us, thank you so much for helping us. He opened his little plastic bag, And his mom had gotten up 4 in the morning to make each of us a special sandwich. And we were so touched um, by her thoughtfulness and his sincere gratitude. It was just a very fond, powerful moment. And all for me, I could just think of the question, how does our country and how does our government treat children? It is a question where there's no clear, good answer, and it certainly empowers me to continue the work. And I wanted to add to this description how we can actually implement an accompaniment project. What we did is we meaning our social justice committee within our congregation, we got together and we had some programs to educate the congregation. We had a film from Brave New Films and a DACA student, an immigration lawyer, and then we had a service. And then we had a training ourselves with Jobs with Justice. And we invited, for all of these events, we invited the local community, other faith institutions, other activists. And out of that, we got a lot of support, a lot of people coming to attend and learn. And then it ended up gaining more and more accompaniers in our congregation and from other community groups. It also helped us form a rapid response team, which is geared toward if ICE comes to a community and we have time, people would call a hotline, we would be notified, and we would come again to witness, to make videos, to take down information, identify, give as much data as we can about the incident, not getting involved. Physically, no confrontation, but being aware and being a presence. That may or may not actually happen. It depends if we get a call or not. But since our institution was created, now we have this organization of allies. We're planning on providing other kinds of services needed in the community, such as free legal clinics and other things. So there's many different ways we can reach out to meet the needs of the community, and the accompaniment process is, I think, a very important one to help support people as they have to deal with the system. With Jobs with Justice, I was asking them, do you have some statistics? And they reported to me that out of about 50 cases, only one was brought to detention. So 1 out of 50 is a very, very good statistic, and that person was not deported. In return, many people got released from detention. So I encourage everyone to get involved.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you for sharing your story. So now we're going to go to Jenny, who's going to share her story. We're doing a little bit of an unconventional microphone moment. So one moment while I give her a call, and then I'm going to rely on you all to give me some thumbs up if you can hear her.
Hi, my name is Jenny, and I was in car with my son. That was very hard situation for my family right now, and for him, for me, because that was something what we didn't expect, and we was handled by ourselves. But the day when I was in the court last last week I was with another person from the community, and they made me feel so strong and like I don't feel that I am by myself right now because this situation is very, very hard. It's very hard, but I just want to say thank you for the people who were there to support me and support my son. I really appreciate it with all my heart. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny, for being willing to speak with us. I'm wondering if there's anything you would want people to know about the immigration system, people who might know less than you, or anything you would want people to know if they are doing this kind of community work.
I can understand really well, like your question,
like if I had never come to court before, is there anything you would want people to think about how they could best support? And it's okay if you don't have an answer.
Yeah, just right now, like I say, is a very hard situation when a family is in that situation right now. It's very, very hard, and I don't really know what I'm saying right now. I just want to say thank you to the people who support my family right now, for the community people. It's like no, you don't feel like by yourself. They speak with you. They make you feel like you are not by yourself. These people, I never meet these people before. It's just I meet them that day. And that I tell them. I do everything by myself, everything. But they made me feel strong. They spoke with my daughter. They helped me to spoke with my daughter because I was so destroyed that I didn't know how to speak with that I give the support to my daughter. So that was the lady over there. She spoke with her, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you to be with us, people that they don't know because they don't know us, but they was there, and just let the people that they help people that they know. I'm sorry, my English is really bad. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Jenny. No need to apologize, and I just want to say, Raquel, who's in our chat, is sending you some love, and I know for me, I will just say, like, all of this work is only possible because people like you are fighting for your loved ones, and you are showing all of us what it looks like to face down these systems. So thank you so much for sharing a bit, and thank you for persevering with the funny phone call situation. I appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
And I know, hang on, I'm back on the headphones. And I did just want to say that, here in Boston, it was actually folks in ICE detention who began much of the organizing here. And so that is really the leadership from which everything is flowing. So I'm now going to invite Reverend Tiffany Curtis, if you would be willing to share a little bit about how you enter into this.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who has spoken so far. And I just want to say that I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on this call and reiterate how much I feel like I'm continuously learning more and more. And I'm here to explore with you all and learn from you all. And so I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I've been here for about a year and a half. And soon after I moved here, actually right when I moved here, the election happened. And then after that, there was a really, due to obviously the rhetoric that came with that election and administration, there was a lot more response around immigration than there had been in the past. And for me, because of my upbringing, which I won't go into all the details, but I grew up in an immigrant faith community and so forth, immigration has been an important issue for me for many years. And so when I moved here, I started connecting, finding out who was working on immigration and making connections. And we're very blessed here. We have some amazing immigration attorneys who do pro bono work or are working for completely nonprofit organizations, as well as a really powerful and effective immigrant-led community organizing organization that works to protect immigrants and immigrant workers. And so through those connections, I basically got a request, me and a couple other folks who are very passionate around immigration work, that these lawyers and these other organizations were getting just inundated with calls and emails of people post-inauguration basically saying, you know, that they were kind of had this fire under them to work on immigration and what could they do. And I think there was this feeling of overwhelm from those folks that like coordinating mass numbers of volunteers was not really part of their job description. They were already really busy doing the direct in the trenches work. And so they basically asked if we would be willing to organize the faith community, because especially a lot of those folks were people from faith communities, you know, who were really coming from their heart and their values. And so we had this idea based on sort of what had happened and who was mostly contacting them, which were mostly allies, citizens, to do an Immigration 101 event as our kickoff event to educate people more who might want to get involved. So it was a great event. We had immigration lawyers speak. We had people present about sort of the history of immigration law and immigration policies, as well as people sharing their testimonies. And out of that, we started having regular meetings, and we have sort of been feeling our way around, figuring out what to do, much of it in direct response to requests that we've received. We are working on creating sort of a sanctuary support system for four-wall sanctuary or sanctuary within a church should that arise. We don't currently have anyone in sanctuary in Santa Fe, but just working to sort of have some infrastructure in place to support that. And then we, shortly after I moved here, New Mexico had an immigrant detention center that opened. It had been a federal prison, federal detention center, and there were actually multiple cases of folks who were incarcerated there who died due to medical malpractice. And so the facility was shut down and shortly thereafter reopened, still with a core civic contract, but this time focused on ICE and immigrant detention. And some of the lawyers here in town who I mentioned, who are fantastic, decided that they wanted to try to win as many cases as possible at this newly opened facility, and let us know that they thought they would need help with some of the logistics if they won the cases. So we started doing transportation and short-term housing for folks in this case particularly, who are winning asylum cases, and just also helping people get clothes, phones, bus tickets, plane tickets, that kind of thing. We've also raised money to support families that lose a breadwinner, either to deportation or fear of returning to their workplace, those kind of things. So, like I said, just really responding to the needs as they come up thus far. We now are working a little bit on doing some campaign research around how we might do a more focused campaign in addition to the direct support work, especially around immigrant detention. And so that's an exciting process that we're in as well. It's just ever evolving and unfolding. So I wanted to share a little bit about this value of upholding choice and dignity. And I think, as Elizabeth mentioned, the way that the system works, so much choice is taken away from people. And I think that sometimes when we're trying to help, we may not be as conscious of that when we're not the ones going through that experience. And so, for example, with the transportation and short-term housing that volunteers have been doing, there were a few instances where, someone picked someone up and drove them to the place that they were staying, and they really bonded on that drive, and they, sort of ended up staying in touch. And the person who was accompanying was really delighted because they felt a lot of connection with the person, and they were so pleased that they wanted to stay in touch with them. But there have also been instances, like one young woman. So Cibola is a men's detention center, but it also has a transgender women's pod. It's the only trans pod in the country. And so there was one young woman, I will call her Sabrina, who won her asylum case, and she went to stay with a family. And I talked to the person who hosted her, and she had been there for many days, and getting her on the plane had been very complicated, and she had sort of really poured out her heart into supporting this young woman. And I said, "Oh, have you heard from her? Do you know if she made it to her family members?" And she said, "No, I didn't hear from her. Her lawyer told me that she made it." And she had this sad look on her face, and she said, "I guess I probably never will hear from her." And that sort of reminded me of, if that's true, that's her choice, and sort of that there's such a range of what people may decide in terms of what kind of relationship they want, and that's okay, and that's actually really good. That's the opportunity to have choice. And it's so important as people who are supporting to remember how much choice has been taken away from folks, and to really radically support choice, even if it might hurt our own feelings, or we might have a desire for more connection than what the other person desires. So just share that as an example. And I intentionally did not share details just to protect the identity of folks. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. There's an organizer here who supports a lot of this work named Gabby, and she often will say it is a privilege that people let us be part of their lives, which definitely feels true for me. All right, Laura.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being part of this webinar. I'd like to talk a little bit about how to really understand and connect with local context. So I'll share a little bit about a year ago, the first city that I got involved with trying to organize around what to do. So this will hopefully both demonstrate if you're in a position where you're still trying to figure it out or navigate through this process. In this particular city, there was a worker center. There was already a lot of great recognized leaders from various immigrant communities, very active pastors involved. And even with that, at the beginning of last year, everything hit with such a shock. And this particular city was just under siege at the beginning, with ICE coming through in the morning and every day just picking up people. So even with all these connections, it was very disorienting at the beginning about like what to do. So part of these networks did just respond. I mean, initially it was a vigil, and sometimes vigils are really great for just seeing who shows up and who's engaged and who else. That's where your network can form. So from there was decisions to really start building a rapid response network and host Know Your Rights trainings. And so all of this, sometimes you are just kind of and I've heard of several things said tonight, that's almost like really, feeling your way through the dark and not being really super confident about which direction to go next. And I think it's really important that this is a time that you've got to have these grounded in relationship and being led by and in relationship with people from the impacted communities. But if you step back and wait for your PhD in accompaniment organizing, you're not going to be very helpful. You'll see in a couple of years. So it is trying to figure it out along the way. So we were doing, again, like Know Your Rights trainings, getting rapid response teams. And the feedback we got from people who were being impacted, people who were having loved ones disappeared in the early morning hours, gave us the feedback that, look, the Know Your Rights training was great, but the reality is when there's an encounter with a police officer, they're not asserting anything. They're just trying to survive that moment. So it wasn't really helpful at that. They was telling us it wasn't helpful at that time. And rapid response, we were really thinking in terms of big raids, and we were going to mobilize people to at least witness, if not confront, and try to intervene in some way. And they were telling us, these things are happening at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning when people were going to work, and we're often all over in like 15 minutes. So there was no way we were going to be mobilizing anybody in the morning. So that there has to be a humility through this process too. Like, okay, this makes sense. We thought this made sense, but the direct feedback was, no, this is not working, and this is what we need. So plan A had to be scrapped, and listening to the people whose families and loved ones are being impacted. And even with that, it was kind of a slow process. So even with all these relationships that had been there for years, people were just so afraid and overwhelmed, and I think in such despair about what was happening. There wasn't a lot of it was quieter than normal relationships and normal organizing that we had. And so it took finally just sharing a meal together, and finally we invited many people from the community. We sat down together. We had people who could help with translation at each table, and folks just talked to each other and shared food. And it took doing that a couple of times. And then at one of those meetings, one of the longtime leaders from this particular immigrant community stood up and said very quietly that he had a nephew that had to go to district court, and he was afraid because ICE has been showing up at district court and nabbing people when they're there, when they should be able to have due process, and instead they're just often victimized by ICE and taken advantage of in those situations. So he was afraid to go and asked if somebody would go with him. So a lot of this work too is just saying yes. At that moment, nobody was really trained or knew what to expect at district court, but we said, yes, you asked us, we will go. And those folks that had that experience came back to the group of supporters and explained what happened, and we learned from it. And from that, we started sending volunteers to just go and get to know what district court is all about, starting to identify who the ICE officers were who were trolling the halls, what vehicles did they drive, so we knew we could tell them if they were there by just looking in the parking lot. So that developed, and from there, in those relationships and keeping in contact with the families, other requests came up. Needed a ride to the ICE field office, or going to federal court, or even just some other things that came up with that folks needed help with. And We just kept saying yes. And it's been an amazing experience of, like, again, saying yes and just figuring it out as you go, and not waiting for not looking for perfection, just kind of doing it and learning and sharing that knowledge. And the network is really important. And what was learned in that city was shared with what developed in Boston, and has been shared with things happening in other parts of the state. And these communities are very different from one another. Not every community has a fabulous worker center there. Who do you reach out to? But finding there are going to be people there, whether it's people organizing just in the community, workers, clergy often are great to reach out to, community-based organizations that provide services. Those connections need to be sought out and made, and those will be your guide. So that's some of the, I think, just holding on to those pieces. Got to listen to, center the voices of the people being impacted, being humble, being able to be flexible, throw out plan A, go to plan B, share the knowledge with the volunteers. The training that developed was a collective effort. And I've done a number of trainings, and every time I do a training, I share all the materials. Okay, now you've been through a training, you can now train other people at your congregation or in your community and continue this work. So nobody, it doesn't require one person who's supposedly the expert. We're all becoming the experts. So being that openness and sharing is really important. And then I think lastly, I loved what Helen, made that point. The accompaniment part is about support. It's not about confrontation. At that moment, it's all about the person. But we're starting to have those conversations, and sometimes separate from accompaniment, when to maybe engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, when to have those confrontations. But even as that develops, that has to be in discussion with leaders from the communities that are being impacted, because if there's going to be any kind of consequence from ICE, they're going to go into those cities and towns. And so there has to be conversation and support around those type of ideas as well. If I hit all the points, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Laura. So much of that resonates. So we have some time if folks want to share questions in the chat. Because of the format, you won't be able to unmute yourself to speak, but you can share questions in the chat. And we will be sending out as much as we can the resources that have been mentioned. So I saw Civic being mentioned in the chat. Helen mentioned Jobs with Justice. I know they've been core to a lot of the organizing here in Boston. So we will try to send those out. So as folks share questions in the chat, I want to pose a question for our amazing storytellers. Would love to hear a little bit about how you bring spirituality into your work.
Is that a question for us, or are you asking, is that something the participants are answering?
That is a question for you all as panelists, if you feel moved.
Oh, I can add, it's challenging. The stories, Helen talked about that, the stories don't always end well. And what happens to families, and when loved ones are taken, and when they're in detention, and the deportation, it's heartbreaking. So the networks that have developed, that I've certainly been part of, it's been wonderful to watch this develop. The volunteers need to make space. The volunteers, the accompaniers, the support folks need to make space to be able to shed those tears, to talk to each other, to care for each other, to check in with each other. There needs to be space for that, and that doesn't happen in front of the family who's having the direct impact of the deportation or the detention. But there's keeping that separate and making that space just to get together and to sing and share words and comfort each other. That's how we I know I find that very helpful, in how we've been including it.
Thank you. Yeah, that resonates with me. And I think also about how we can bring whatever our spiritual practices are, whether that's prayer, like you said, song, or like the beautiful story you told, Laura, of like eating together, any of those things that we know ground and nourish ourselves. are totally relevant in how we move in community in this way. So a few questions that have arisen in our chat, but Tiffany or Helen or Janice, if you have more to share on the role of spirituality, can share too. So Reverend Charlene asks, have you created coalitions for shared actions? And then maybe I'll just say a few of the questions because you may be like, oh, I have a story for that for one, but not for another. And then Nicole asks, thoughts about visiting detention centers and ways to advocate for humane conditions or more humane conditions. And there's some questions about tracking the impact, stories, how to track stories from Jim. And then another question about best ways to communicate requests and pass on information to volunteers. I can share a little bit about that last one. I am not sure that we have found the best way, but what we do is we have a Google Voice line that is accessible to anyone. And then we do have a phone number that we ask folks to call who are in detention. It has to be set up a little differently. And then we use email. But I'm really excited to figure out how we can use some sort of text system as well, because there's just limitations to the quickness that email gets a response.
If I can just add into that, though, for at least the spreadsheet, I think this is important to keep track of your volunteers. And as you're gathering that information, one thing we made a point of doing is as people sign up to be part of these networks, they indicate when they're available and what they're willing to do. So that way, if you have, 300 people in your network, all 300 aren't getting every single request. So we sort that information. People who are available on Mondays only get notified about Monday actions. Or if you're only able to write a letter, you're not going to be notified about letters, but when there's time to write a letter, you will get that email so that it's not as overwhelming. And I've gotten a lot of positive response from people so that when an email comes through, and we try to keep it consistent of what the subject line, so it stands out and people know to respond quickly rather than getting dozens of emails, and after a while they start tuning out and looking at them. So that I thought was really important.
Thanks, Laura. And there are some folks who I know are thinking about, some people have developed some really cool software. And so some of us are in communication about if there's ways to share that more widely. Tiffany, I saw you unmuted, so.
Yeah, well, I wanted to respond to the question about visitation of detention centers and advocating for humane conditions. I think the best resource I know of is Civic, which is a national, actually they just changed their name to Freedom for Immigrants, but it's a national organization that supports visitation programs, local visitation programs. They also do advocacy work on sort of a larger scale. I'm not an expert on Civic, but I have interacted with some Civic affiliated visitation programs, and their website is great and has a lot of information. So I would recommend that. And as Elizabeth said, we can send out links later as well.
Yeah, because ICE rents beds in facilities that are run by so many different jurisdictions, like sheriffs or county or state, or like Tiffany is working with private facilities, private for-profit facilities, exactly the best way to get in can be wide-ranging. Something that we've learned here is how to work well in our ecosystem. Like, we are not experts on the legal rights of folks in specific jails or prisons, but there are folks who are. So we've started being able to refer folks to people who can help advocate around things like food, access to visits, that type of thing. I do think in my experience, it's pretty limited how far we can get in terms of bettering the conditions in these facilities. Like, they are created to be harmful, violent experiences. And so it's important to figure out how to buffer against that as best we can, and also know that there's just limitations there. Janice, I see your hand.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just want to note that sometimes folks will say, what can one little person do? My efforts are just not sufficient. I think it's really important to know that every little effort matters greatly. And we know that every case will not end joyfully. But for those in that situation, they will know that they were treated with dignity by those of us who care. They were treated with love, and that helps them even in the devastation of not being successful in the case. But to know that people are treating you with dignity, your whole humanity, within that system that is so not the norm, our little efforts mean the world.
Thank you, Janice. Yeah, we've been talking about also, like, how do we redefine wins? We had someone who reached out from detention and was owed wages that were not paid by his former employer. And I kind of thought, like, this is a really hard situation. I don't know what we can do. But we found some volunteers to make some calls, and he kept advocating for himself. He kept calling to be in touch, to share information. And we were eventually able to get the Attorney General's office involved. And he is being paid $7,000 US that in wages that are owed to him. And he's been deported. So that's being paid to him where he is now. But, like, in some ways, like, it wasn't a win because he was deported, but in other ways, like, he was given the money that he worked for and fought for his rights as a worker and won. So, especially in this political moment, sometimes the win is getting someone out on bond. It doesn't mean their case goes away, but it means they're home. It means they're with their family. It means they statistically have a much better shot at winning their case. That can be a huge win. Which I hope talks a little bit to your question, Jim, about what happens to folks when they're deported. And another thing we've been able to do is, like, we have so many incredible nonprofits in some places, but a lot of times their scope is very narrow because their funding requires it to be so. And for those of us who are part of networks that are not nonprofits and have more of a mutual aid way of functioning, we get to support folks after they've been deported, and we get to figure out what that can look like. And so sometimes that's connecting with folks on the ground, trying to find ways to get people jobs, support families that may still be here. And all of that is a little more possible because we're just able to hear a request. And like Laura said, figure out how we can say yes. We have a great question from an immigration rights lawyer. What advice do you have for lawyers in working with folks who are doing this accompaniment work? What do you wish lawyers would do to make your role easier or better? First, our endless gratitude. I don't know if we can get you a massage somehow. Feel like anyone doing legal work in that area right now, it's a lot to say yes to. So that's a question. Feel free to unmute any panelists if you have responses. I would say, in my experience, feel free to be direct and proactive about how we can best show up, because I think for many of us, immigration law is not our background, and so we're learning a lot. And it's really helpful when lawyers say, like, this is really helpful, or this makes me nervous. And then we are here doing some immigration attorneys have basically said, like, there's different things that I can do. Like, we have some attorneys who will answer our questions over email. They're clear they can't take new cases, but they're happy to advise on a quick turnaround. And that's huge if someone calls and asks for support to be able to consult with someone. We have some other folks who are actually serving as mentor attorneys for non-immigration attorneys who are willing to take people's cases pro bono, which is a pretty significant gift. But at least here, where it's only like 12% of people have representation, it can be huge to have even a non-immigration attorney who's being advised by an immigration attorney take your case.
I just like to add, I think if there's a network that's doing this in your area, being connected to them is really helpful. There was a group of public defenders that met with us to help us become more engaged in a few cities in the district court level. And there's been a number of individual lawyers that we've developed, we being the people in the accompaniment networks, enough of a relationship we can call and ask advice. If they can't take the person, they can connect us to. So I think just being part of that web of support is critical, because that's been really challenging. Like I said, there's really low number. Everybody should have a lawyer, but the reality is it's a very small percentage that does have a lawyer.
I mean, I think one thing I would add is here we also have very low representation. I think if there was a study done that, like, if every immigration lawyer in New Mexico and Texas worked at full capacity, they would still only be able to cover like 6% of detained folks. So it is very low, and there's a program that two of the law organizations that we work with have been doing that I think has been really effective, and that utilizes volunteers. So I just want to put it out there. They're calling it PALS, Program for Access to Legal Services, and it's sort of like a weekly drop-in program, in this case the detention center, where anyone who's detained can come just sort of get legal information, regardless of whether they will be represented by an attorney. And it's at least another way, in addition to, as Elizabeth said, potentially mentoring or supervising other lawyers who are not trained in immigration law, and just generally, being in touch with all of us, as Laura said as well, so that we can work collaboratively as best as possible. But I also know that it's really challenging, and people's time is really full. And even though we've been working closely with the lawyers that we work with, I also find communication can be hard sometimes, in terms of people's time. So.
And I would just add also, don't be afraid to ask. Like, I've had lawyers say to me, like, oh, I had a client who needed a ride home from ICE and we couldn't figure it out. And so, like, again, it's all about the relationships. And when we don't know what to do, we just need to weave the community tighter. But figuring out, I think I know that I'm always happy to hear from a lawyer to say, like, oh, what would be really great is letters of support that say this thing. I'm like, yes, we can do that. Like, we cannot change federal laws right now, but that we can do. So I know we're approaching time. Just want to thank all of our panelists, and I know Janie isn't with us anymore, but as maybe a closing thought, I'm curious if folks have where you feel like your work needs to grow, or what is the next step. And this is also an invitation for folks joining in the audience to think, like, where is your next move? What is the piece of the road that's in front of you? And for some folks, it may be going deeper around anti-racism work, and how do we intervene on the saviorism that can creep into some of this. It may be like we're at the very beginning, and like we need to figure out who is the right person to have a conversation with a local worker center. So just a moment for both panelists and for people joining to just check in. It may be about having a conversation with your social justice team at your congregation or with your minister. Having a clergy person go to offer witness and support is a great first or second or third or fourth move. So any panelists have where is your growth edge that you are willing to share? Tiffany.
Yeah, I feel like where I and the network are going next is trying to deepen our connections with the allied groups that we work with, and really, like I said, think about how we might be able to use the privilege and access that we have in other ways to advocate and organize. And I especially have been thinking about how do we connect the dots around other forms of criminalization and policing injustice, and continue to really push against the narrative of like good immigrants and bad immigrants, and just honor the dignity of all people in the ways in which these systems are interconnected, and as Elizabeth said in her introduction, criminalize people's very existences. And so that's an area that I want to push into further and explore further, both myself but also with the people that I'm working with.
I'm working also with a group of immigrant rights advocates and our local police department and sheriff's department to try to change policy. It's a very long-term project, but we are meeting every 3 months and meeting with the Department of Justice to try to come to an understanding, to try to develop some sort of accountability and transparency, and to, with the goal of hopefully changing policy. But it's a way to just to bring light to this, to let them see alternative ways. And our questions are leading to them to look at some things that they're doing in different ways, and it's another way to advocate. So that's one thing that we're doing.
Thank you, Helen, for bringing in the systemic transformation piece. Thank you. And I just want to shout out some of the folks in the chat who are also in this work. Francis reflecting on how crucial finding a lawyer, a pro bono attorney can be. Absolutely is a huge, huge difference. A shout out from someone who works at a worker center whose name is cut off, so I can't quite see it. Gratitude to everyone who is working at worker centers, and glad this was useful in thinking about what faith communities can offer. I definitely am happy to share contact info. I'll get with the panelists offline so you can discern whether that makes sense for you, but I'm very happy to be in touch with folks. Any other what is next from you, Laura, or from Janice?
I can share. I'm ready for some big action. This work has been so crucial, and I'm in conversations. I'm ready for some serious civil disobedience and shutting stuff down.
Yeah, it definitely it is a very powerful way to connect to the fire when it's right in front of you. Yeah. Well, we are at time, so I want to paraphrase some of the words that Toshi Reagan sang to us at the beginning about action, calling out our names. How do we keep moving with our hearts hurting and our bodies starting to tire? And big gratitude to all of you who are finding ways to keep moving, to find the yes, to not let the messiness and the confusion keep us from figuring out how to have each other's backs. So gratitude to everyone who joined also, and hope folks have a lovely evening. And oh, thank you so much. Paul is reminding me that I should announce an upcoming interactive e-course happening in collaboration between Love Resists at the UA and USC and American Friends Service Committee. So there'll be follow-up about that, and I'm really grateful for the folks who are thinking through this upcoming course in May through August that's really going to also focus on how do we live our anti-racist values? How do we be really vigilant about the way that white supremacy can move in this work? And it's also just, there's so many gratitudes being shared in the chat, but also just little snippets of ways folks are showing up for each other. So thank you for sharing about vigils organized outside detention centers, hosted by different congregations. Thank you, Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network, for joining us. And here's also a few links that we will also send out for folks who might want more information. All right. Thank you all, and particularly snaps to panelists. Thank you, Janice, for grounding us. And thank you, Paul, for running tech. Thanks all.